Thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I love that presentation on the history, by the way. I think a 50-year-old sector, it makes you feel quite old when you realise you've worked in it for over 30 of those years. But hey, I think you used the term quite a new profession, and I guess in a lot of ways it is. But FM spending in the UK represents 3% of our total GDP. So for a new profession, it's pretty big and it's pretty important. And there's not very many industries that you can say are 3% of GDP. So interesting. Anyway, my name's John Raspin. I'm one of the partners at Frost & Sullivan. As I mentioned, I've worked as a facility management analyst for coming up to 30 years, slightly around 30 years. And I'm going to share with you today a few of our observations on what we see going on in the FM world and what we see going on in the markets. I think a bit of a theme of what we've heard already this morning is, does anyone get the impression there's a lot going on in the world at the moment? One of the great things about working in FM is that everything impacts us, right? It's very hard to think of a trend, a mega trend, a theme that doesn't somehow find its way into what we look at. Is it about the way businesses are impacted by the wider economic issues, and then what that then means that they put pressure back onto the way we manage facilities and workplaces as a result of that? Is it about the prioritization of things like ESG, decarbonisation solutions or whatever? I'm not going to stand here and go through all of these, but you get my message that there's a lot going on. It's very complicated. If you work in FM, you're dealing with that complexity every day. What's going to come next? What do I wake up in the morning to find in the news tomorrow? Tariffs are up, tariffs are down. We're slowing down, we're moving net zero out a little bit further. We're accelerating. The government have made a new decision that means, what can we expect to come and hit us next year, whatever it may be. The last decade has been quite interesting, hasn't it? I think we got that from the history suite, but here we are at the beginning of 2026. Just so happens exactly 10 years ago, the Brexit referendum, around 6 years ago, the beginning of COVID, around 3 or 4 years ago, probably the highest levels of inflation that many of us had ever seen in our lives in the UK, and here and now still talking about economic uncertainty as we have been for quite a while. You can see some of the story there, but there's a rather ugly, weird-looking chart along the bottom of here across that same timeline that plots the GDP growth in the UK against the FM market growth in the UK. Now, you can work out what weird stuff happened around 2020 with the COVID pandemic, but what's quite interesting, a few things here. Firstly, FM outperforms the economy. FM growth has been above GDP growth throughout that period. So actually, the sector has dealt remarkably well with a pretty turbulent 10-year period in terms of performance. Another thing that's quite interesting is that growth in FM spend is higher post-COVID than it was before, even in a very mature sector, typically, right? As typically in a market, we talk about the UK, by the way, there's not many industries you can say this about, but in facility management, the UK is probably the most mature and sophisticated market of anywhere in the world. As Sarah was talking about, we've been outsourcing for longer in the UK than probably anywhere else in the world. And a lot of other countries and companies from other countries look to the UK to learn from the FM industry, to learn what they might do, and probably just as much to learn what they might not do. But it's a mature sector, so to see growth higher than it was a few years ago is relatively unusual. So perhaps actually the pandemic, although it was pretty horrible and pretty turbulent, and actually at that particular period around 2020, 21, was a lot of companies wondering how on earth they were going to come out of some of the trauma of that period. Maybe weirdly, the pandemic was actually quite good for the FM industry because it completely accelerated the use cases for deployment of technology. It accelerated the shifting of the conversation towards ESG and sustainability and decarbonisation. It accelerated the realisation that workplace was going to change an awful lot quicker. We'd all been talking about the future of work for quite a long time, but it was a kind of theoretical, interesting discussion about how and where we'd work in the future. All of a sudden, it was right upon us. and it's really accelerated. So quite interesting sort of to see how that's changed. And don't forget that Sarah mentioned, you know, right before the pandemic, an awful lot of companies were struggling. You mentioned the Carillion collapse, you mentioned the troubles with Interserve. There was an awful lot of the big FM players in the country. Go back and look at the finances from that period versus that period, and they'll be quite pleased that that's in the past. So interesting. Being an analyst, I'm just going to spend a little, we'll come back to some interesting trends, but I just want to spend a little bit of time looking at numbers because it's part of what we do, analysing and quantifying market size and growth. I mentioned that FM spend in the UK is about 3% of GDP. You can see on the right up there, we spend about £77 billion a year on FM, of almost half of which is outsourced FM market, as we call it. But here's an interesting question. How many of you who work in FM companies, just a little bit of a show of hands if you prefer, how many of you have an expectation of your business to grow at more than 3% a year? In your budgets, in your sales plans, whatever it is. Most, right? But the industry is growing at about 3% a year. So you mentioned 4%, we'll say we're more or less there. It's actually a bit higher at the moment, but in the years out to 2032, it's going to be around 3%. So if everybody's budgeting growing faster than that, you've all got to outpace the market. Now that's mathematically impossible that everybody's going to outpace the market, but the fact that everybody wants to grow at faster than what is really happening helps explain a lot of what's going on in the market. It's why we see high rates of M&A. It's why we see such fierce competition. It's why we see companies increasingly going after first-generation outsourcing and thinking, well, maybe we can grow the addressable market by attacking the in-house component of the market and trying to bring companies or organizations who are doing things for themselves into the outsourcing market. So it helps sort of understand and explain that. We do a lot of segmenting of markets at Frost & Sullivan. We like our data. I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can see how FM spending splits out between single service delivery models, between different service types, different customer sectors, and so on. But what I think is more interesting is where the growth's at. Okay, what you'll see just going through each of these, same segmentations, when we look at what we call contract type or delivery model, service integration is still accounts for about a quarter of total outsourced FM spending in the UK, and it's still the fastest growing. Okay, it's the smallest part of the market, but it's still the fastest growing. So there is still that move towards service integration, but it's increasingly being challenged. You're probably feeling and seeing that a little bit in the market as well. The difference in growth between the contract delivery models is actually leveling out, partly as IFM models and TFM models and the like mature, but also because customers become more sophisticated over time. And actually a lot of the perceived historical wisdom over what would drive an IFM contract comes into question when customers back themselves to make procurement decisions and look for service specialization, look for different ways of doing things. So we're beginning to see that level out. We still see slightly stronger growth in the market for hard services over soft services, which also explains a lot of the behavior, a lot of the M&A behavior in the market. If you look at a lot of the recent investments have been fundamentally hard services led, which also feeds into the IFM growth, because as we know, a lot of IFM delivery is built off a hard FM capability. And increasingly, I'm not going to do I think this is the last slide of data, but probably one of the most important shifts in the sector, in the FM industry as a whole in the last few years is the hard focus on customer sectors. Anyone who's been in FM for a while, you'd have to be honest and say if you go back probably only 10 or 12 years, we didn't really have customer alignment strategies. Offerings were driven by service capability and an assumption that if you were good at doing something, you could take it into any environment. Some companies had higher exposure to certain sectors, but you didn't really have strategies driven by customer alignment and customer sector specialization. And now that is probably the biggest, most important strategic shift in kind of corporate strategic thinking in FM companies. And there's two reasons behind that. One is because customers expect it and demand it. It's pretty tough to get in front of a customer these days if you can't tell a story around exactly what the business or the operations of that organization are all about. And the second is on here, that actually if you're chasing growth of above the industry average of 3%, it would be sensible to go where the growth is and actually be going after some of the sectors that are likely to outperform the average. Okay? So what do we expect to see this year and beyond? A lot of these topics have already been talked about, but I'll just pick off a few. We'll certainly see further intensification of the AI buzz. I'll come back to that in a moment. But I think what we're seeing, as often happens after a period of 2 or 3 years of hype and innovation, you start to see the pressure coming onto, well, what are the use cases? How are we actually really going to order this into prioritizing where we go, where we're actually going to see returns on investments or on activities around AI? The other is just in the broadest sense about tech innovation. We're probably still in the period of what I think of as fastest sort of tech innovation in the history of the industry. But I don't know about you guys, but I'm certainly starting to hear more and more when you talk to CFOs in a lot of big companies, they're starting to crank the pressure back into the organization, saying, where are the returns on a lot of the investments we've made in the last few years, whether you're on the customer side or the supplier side? When are we going to actually start to see a bit more monetization of what we've been doing here? So we're beginning to see a bit of a shift in the language around tech innovation. I just talked about the importance of customer alignment. We say customer alignment will win. I think that it might sound really obvious when you think about it. I mean, what sector doesn't have customer alignment as a strategy? But actually in the FM industry, it's relatively new for it to be as important as it is now. We've heard a lot already this morning about the human-centric workplaces. I think actually the whole role of the FM plays in delivering outcomes for people in their workplace is a significant shift in language from where we were not all that long ago, and we certainly see a further acceleration of that. Decarbonisation, ESG is an interesting one because you'd have been forgiven at the beginning of last year for thinking, oh, well, that's gone. We've had all this kind of acceleration and urgency around a theme that suddenly, with a few speeches from a president on the other side of the world, an awful lot of organisations start lowering their expectations on decarbonisation. But actually, we don't really see that. I think what we're beginning to see is the journey and the roadmaps changing a little bit, but actually we see just as much urgency, and actually the overall journey for decarbonisation is still very much as it was. I think actually, if you think how much is to be done on ESG and sustainability, actually extending things for a few years is not really going to reduce the size of the opportunity. And in many cases, that was what the roadmap was likely to look like anyway. We've already heard earlier about the ongoing prevalence of M&A activity in the industry. It's always going to happen in a mature world like the FM market is. And actually, if you were to dive into the dynamics of the industry, it's quite concentrated at the top sort of third or so of the total market share in the UK. But there's still a lot of fragmentation of service specialists or regional specialists in the lower end of the market. And the other, of course, is private equity investment acceleration. I'm sure many of you will have had conversations with private equity investors over the years. The FM industry has always been very attractive to private equity. There's a lot of great underlying characteristics of the market. Growth may not be all that high, but it's fairly solid and sustainable. There's repeatable revenue streams, but most importantly, there's lots of room for consolidation, which obviously that type of investment likes. And we will continue to see interest from private equity in the FM space, no doubt. But what's quite interesting about that is not that it happens, it's that the impact that tends to have on the market, because private equity money coming into organizations increases the growth expectation on those particular companies. So you tend to see different behaviors in the market from companies that are private equity led versus other types of companies. So that's an interesting one to look out for. Just going through a few of those in a little bit more detail. When we talk about technology innovation, and I was talking about kind of increasing pressure on monetizing or on seeing real progress in the kind of the impact of technology in our markets, I think FM is no different to any other space, where for a little while we've probably seen, and maybe many of you have been involved in discussions where you sit around a table saying, we've got this great tech platform, or we've got this great widget that we can take to the market, how can we use it? Or somebody's developed this cool looking thing in our R&D department, there must be something clever we can do with it. Well, guess what? In almost any industry, that doesn't really get you very far. And it's quite hard to take a message to a customer that a technology is cool. But actually, you start thinking about it from the other end and saying, well, actually, the whole, in the FM world, as we were hearing before, is very much about people. It's about services. It's about actually managing relationships and outcomes with customers. Technology is valuable when it's layered on top of that, and it's delivering powerful outcomes that customers actually want. So why not think of innovation from the outcome end back, rather than from the technology end going forward? Again, it's one of those things that sounds quite obvious, but you'd be surprised at how rarely it happens. Another thing we see is that, I may have been guilty of it myself in the past, but I'm sure many companies like us who talk about the evolution of a sector tend to use slides like this to talk about the direction of the sector and how we've moved from a service delivery focus to a sort of optimization focus, and we're moving into the era of everything being about user experience and productivity and shifting from a cost-based model to a value-based model. And I think it's quite interesting because a lot of the transformation of the sector is about that language, about how technology changes things, about how the value proposition changes things when you start thinking about delivering productivity rather than just solving the problems of your client. But guess what? Actually, this is really complex. And actually, this transformation isn't about moving from a point over here to a point over here. It's about your customers or your customer base becoming much more complex, because even individual organizations will have times where they think like this, times where they think like this, and times where they think like this. So you're actually not managing a situation where you think, oh, well, all we've got to do is stop doing this and start doing this. It's about saying, how can we have the right conversation for any type of customer that could be anywhere on this type of screen. Another thing that's changing is if you put yourself in the position of, and I'm sure we've got plenty of customers in the room, but if you put yourself in the shoes of an organization, the way you think about FM, the way you think about the solutions or outcomes or the way you're going to make your decisions is also changing. And what we call the FM ecosystem, not just the competitive situation, but the FM ecosystem of all the different type of companies that are bringing solutions to the market to help companies make better decisions or become more efficient or whatever it may be in their kind of FM of the future. Companies who you may not have thought of as competitors in the past are effectively competing for the same spend, or companies that you may not have thought as likely collaborators or partners in the past are becoming potential collaborators and partners for the future. So convergence of technology and of competition and so on actually do quite a lot to completely transform the way an ecosystem of a market looks. And it would be foolish to not recognize that companies who you might be having a very different relationship with in the future can come from there. I know that there's going to be other discussions that are going to do much more justice to talking about technology than me, but we do a lot of work looking at AI, how AI is evolving in the sector. So I just wanted to sort of share a few thoughts on that. We're still at the stage where an awful lot of the sort of usable stuff happening in the market today is actually operational efficiency based. So we're using technology to do better or to do things that we're already doing more efficiently, which kind of makes sense, right? And the use cases there are at their most strong where you've got large amounts of complex or unstructured data that can be analyzed better, more data-led decision making and so on. But actually what we're starting to see beneath that on here, which is in many ways where the market starts to become more interesting, is whole new AI-led value propositions that can be taken to market where technology supports the kind of the human-facing service delivery part of what's going on in the market. And some are fundamentally driven by the FM industry itself, many as you can see on there. Others are about leveraging expertise from neighboring sectors and industries that are perhaps further ahead. If you look at, you hear a lot of talk about things like preventative maintenance, predictive maintenance, and the role that AI plays, particularly in industrial environments or on the kind of the hard services side of FM. Well, guess what? That's way ahead of us in the industrial automation environment, for example, and there's some great lessons we can learn from there to bring things back. So AI is not just about looking at what we can create, it's also about looking at what we can learn from other sectors and bring across. Sustainability and ESG, of course, is a good example. Again, I'm not going to do a sort of a full presentation on this because there's other things on the agenda, but it's a great area because of the data intensity, because of the fact that over time we've got data that feeds into most companies, ESG, sustainability, energy management, components of their business coming from multiple different sources, that technology has a huge role to play in bringing things together. Plus, it's an increasingly complex area anyway, where we've got, not just managing our kind of energy and environmental components for efficiency reasons, but we've got regulation, we've got reporting. So again, a really good area there. And then last slide on this, just to kind of finish with that key component, which is very much what FM is all about, which is that through the eyes of the facility manager on the customer side, there's a heck of a lot going on. When we ask people what are their pain points, you can see from here that there's a lot to be thinking about. And you can also probably see, given that this is a word cloud, that some of the things that jump out the most are around things like cost and budget. So when we talk about a really exciting FM future, driven by technology, focused on sustainability and workplace and user experience and people, we've still got to remember that all that has to be achieved while delivering cost savings for the customer. So you can see why it's complex and fun, but it mustn't be forgotten. So I'll just leave you with a few. It's a bit of an ugly slide. I'm not going to read through all of these, but just a few of the conclusions of what we've talked about. I talked a little bit about where we see growth in the market. I think, going forward, when we talk about digitalization and technology innovation, that has to be focused on real outcomes. I think there's been a real shift in the language recently away from things like efficiency and TCO and genuinely talking about sort of value-adding outcomes. The FM industry, unfortunately, has always had a little bit of a reputation of being focused around problem solving. But actually, the transformation at the moment, if you really want to sum it up for me, is all about shifting from problem solving to value adding. And we're deep into that journey at the moment, but that's got to really start to come through in the language of the next few years as well. So thank you very much. And with that,